when you first open Blender, this is obviously what you see. There's the cube and all of these tabs. And you don't actually need to know like what each tab is for and what it does, but I mean it does kind of explain it by what's on the tab. And all they are though are just tabs where it's set up to do the thing that's there. Like you can set up new tabs of your own. There's nothing specific about these that you have to use it this way. I don't use most of them. I just usually sit on shading and change it to look like this. Oh, go down.
My bad.
Sorry. Yeah, I just use it. I work most of the time in Blender like this, where I just model. And then when I do some shading, I just bring this over and start shading. And yeah, I guess the first thing I can teach is how you make split the windows and combine them. If you go to a corner of any window, it comes up with that little white crosshair. And then if you click and drag into the window, it brings a new one. If you click and drag towards another window, it combines them. Yeah, so that's the tabs. Yeah, like I said, I just use this one. You can kind of see animation has ready with a like timeline slider, one place where it shows you kind of what it looks like plain without all of this stuff showing, because you can't get rid of it just with this button, with all the grid and axes. So you could have your technical things going on, but see what it looks like plain while you're playing the animation. Shading, like I said, just had like files for textures you might want to bring in a shading window, and I already changed it. Texture painting is like set up so that you can actually like paint on your objects. UV editing is a kind of more complex thing, which I'll go into more in depth in like another lesson, but it's basically unwrapping the mesh of your shape to texture it better. Like you can see this cube obviously unwraps nicely to that shape, and you can manually decide how it unwraps to change the shape. Sculpting, obviously for sculpting, and there's a whole bunch of sculpting tools. I've done a little bit of sculpting, and this is again something I'll go into a lot more in depth at some point. But yeah, sculpting is how most people make like characters of like 3D animal characters, like cute ones, and 3D humanoid characters and aliens and whatnot are mostly made through sculpting. Modeling is just, modeling, editing a shape, and I'll go into obviously how we do all of this manipulation and adding loops and extruding shapes and things like that after I run through all of these tabs. Sorry about the sneeze. Whoa.
Bless you.
I stopped the sneeze by saying that. Which is really annoying. I actually wanted to sneeze there. Yeah, so that's the tabs, and layouts, just like layout. I usually have layouts set up with my camera angle perfectly focused in like fully rendered mode, so that whenever I want to see what it looks like, I can just quickly pop to layout and it's like, oh, okay, that's what it looks like, and then go back to modeling and whatnot. Yeah, so let's go into these tabs. Oh, first, I mean, up here is just the list of items, so anytime you spawn something, and again, I'll go into this menu a bit and how you spawn things and certain settings you get when you spawn an object a bit later, but when you do have multiple objects, they're all just spawning inside each other. That's why I didn't look at like anything came up. It all comes up here, and you can double click and then change the name of these as well, and you can right click and create new collections and just drag and drop them in to like kind of help organize your scene. Like for the Cosmiqs, for example, I had tons of folders with obviously like the planets, the eyes, the mouths, the backgrounds all separated out to make it a lot more organized and easier to manage. Yeah, so now onto these tabs. So this is kind of how you control everything other than the shape of what you're doing, which you obviously model here. Everything else like you can control from these tabs. So the first one is your render settings, and I'll go into a lot more detail of these towards the end, where once I've kind of showed how to make something, and I'll just then quickly run through how to set up the render settings quickly. But yeah, basically you have the render engine, which to begin with you'll either use Eevee or Cycles. If you have a really less powerful computer, you can use Eevee because it's much easier to run, whereas Cycles is proper like ray traced light. So if you have a weaker computer, it can take a longer time to render using Cycles than Eevee. Then there's the feature set, which just basically never touch this, just leave unsupported. Experimental is when new features come out, but they're not always stable, so I've never used just leave it supported. Basically, don't worry about it. device. If you have a GPU, you should switch this to GPU. Blender will always start and have it on CPU, but if you have a GPU, make sure you switch that to GPU. And now sampling is basically when you render something in Blender. I'll just quickly set up a camera so I can show this better. Let's get a camera, pull it out, and then I'll just get some light, because otherwise it'll just be a dark scene. No, not another camera, a light. Let's make that a bit bigger. Just give some light. Yeah, so when you render, it samples the image like one at a time, running an image over it, and so that's the number that we had there for samples. It's just how many times it renders the image on top of each other, making the details finer and finer, basically. So there's two places where you have the setting, which is here in the viewport, so how many samples you want it to run here, and then in the actual render. So because your viewport, you're going to be constantly moving around, you don't want the samples to be really high. You just want to keep it nice and low so that you can quickly move around, because if you have it, there's no point in having it high, because, well, right now this is an incredibly simple scene, so we're not seeing it lag at all. But if it was more complex and you had the samples here really high, it's just no point, because as you move it, it's never going to have time to run through them. So yeah, I just leave that at like 20 or 30. And then for your render samples, like, again, this can depend on your computer or the complexity of the scene, and I'll go more into that later, but anywhere from 50 to 200 is fine. And I would also turn off the noise threshold. When you go into Blender actually first, it'll probably say 1000 and something here and 4000. Just bring it down and then turn off this noise threshold. It'll give you better render results. The rest of this is essentially unneeded to even worry. Yeah, like, you don't need to worry about it at first. Some of these things like color management you can do when rendering to just like add some contrast and stuff. When you're doing animations, you can turn on motion blur just to make it look a tiny bit more realistic. Light paths, again, that's something I can go into a lot more detail when we talk about actually rendering, but it's basically how many times the light bounces before it stops. But yeah, like, when you're starting out, just don't even worry about all of this. All you need to worry about is how many samples and that these settings are correct. Yeah, so moving on to the output properties. This is just where you basically choose the resolution of your render. So right now when I render it, it's rendering a 1920 by 1080p image, and you can obviously set that to whatever you want. Most NFTs, for example, are squares, so they're 1080 by 1080. But Cosmiqs were 4K, so it was like 2560 by 2560, I think I put it as. This is where you change the frame rate for animations in here, and when you're outputting animation frames too, you would choose where they go here. Otherwise, when you render an image, you can just click save as and save it that way. And that's basically all you need to worry about here as well. Like, there's a lot of stuff that you don't need to worry about. There's like tons of settings and things everywhere that when you start out, they're just completely irrelevant to think about until you're more comfortable with how to model and make something and just render an image, and then you can slowly add on more complications. So a lot of the time I'll be saying just don't worry about that, because there's at least 50 to 60% of stuff I haven't even touched, and I can still obviously make the stuff I've made. So it's not needed until you want to do something specific that requires that thing. So yeah, let's keep going. Like, so yeah, for example, this tab, the only things I think I've ever touched here is turning on denoising data, because it allows you to get better denoising than the base denoising that just happens anyway. And I'll go into more detail of how to use that when we actually render something, and I talk about the compositing. And yeah, other than that, in here, I don't think I've ever touched anything. So don't worry about it, basically. Because you don't need to worry about it. It's not worth thinking about, because it's very specific, turning on and off how light interacts with surfaces. And if you have a surface that you think light's interacting with weirdly, maybe you can come and just turn some of these on and off and see what it does. But otherwise, yeah, just kind of forget about everything in there. Yeah, because it's about render layers too, where you can you could have like this cube on one layer and this cube on another layer, and you'd have to then combine the layers in the compositing, and it gets complicated. And again, that's for like later down the line of teaching, basically. For now, ignore it. Essentially the same here. I don't think I've actually ever touched anything here except for gravity when doing animations. This just turns on and off gravity in the scene, so if you apply physics to your objects, which is one of the tabs down here, and you turn off gravity, they won't fall. I mean, and that's kind of the only thing you need to worry about in here. Yeah, there's nothing else. I've never used this tab really. Alright, world settings. So the world settings is a bit more important and something you probably should know about. And it controls what the world looks like. So right now the world is just this gray. It's like, it's basically like we're inside a gray sphere. But you can do whatever you want to the world. Basically, you can make it. If I just go to the shading tab, so like the way to get to changing the world is it's essentially a texture. So just like you change a texture or a material on an object, you do the same thing for the world. So pop into the shading tab, and inside the shader editor. So this is what the shader, like base shader in Blender looks like, and it has all of the things you'd expect, like color, roughness, and a lot of other complicated things that again we'll get more into later when we come to the materials tab. But yeah, to get to the world, you can just change up here from object to world, and then you see it's the world. So right now it's just gray. If I change this color, the world becomes black. You can change it to white, and then it goes all the way white, and obviously that affects the lighting on your objects in the scene. And you can put an outdoor scene here. For example, there's things called HDRIs, which are essentially 360 degree images of a scene, obviously wherever the image was taken, and you can use those to light your scene with more realistic lighting if you don't want to use like the built-in Blender lamps, for example. And again, I'll go into detail of how you do that a bit later on. Yeah, I think that's the only thing here again that's important to worry about first. Let's go back to this tab. So yeah, so you can change the color, and I'll talk about how we put an image on it later on when I'm lighting some objects. Otherwise, everything else here you don't have to worry about. Just leave it as it is. Collection. I've never even used this tab, so we're just gonna move on from it. I don't actually know what it does, and you don't need to use it because I've never needed to use it. Yeah. So this tab definitely has some things about it, such as your object's location can be and rotation. So basically, the translation of your object in 3D space can be chosen by controlled by this tab. This is the Object Properties tab. So right now this cube is on 0, 0, 0, like it's not been rotated or translated in any direction. But if I change this, then it'll move the cube. And this is not the way I would recommend you like move things around in the space. I'll talk about how to do that like better later. But the one thing I do use this for is animating movement and rotation sometimes, because it's just slightly more accurate because of how you keyframe it. Because for example, if I want to do a rotation of this, the way to do it is I want to rotate in the z-axis. You would click RZ to rotate in the z-axis. So I would keyframe it, which you do by pressing I. Again, I'll talk more detail about animation either today or in another video or another like tutorial. But yeah, so you click I, you choose what you want to lock at this point in time. So I'm just going to click location, rotation, and scale, and then you see that then turns these all yellow, which is basically showing there's a keyframe there. Now if I if I tried to rotate this 360 degrees, I would probably get it slightly off. So instead, you can just come over here, click onto the z-axis, type 360, and then press I here, and it does another keyframe. Oh, and it would have animated a spin, but I didn't change where the keyframe was on the timeline. So let me just do that. Since I showed it, I should probably show that it works. So I'll put that back to 0. again, press I, put the keyframe, move that just to anywhere, type 360, press I, and again, I'll go more into detail with this later and slower, but now you see that rotates it. So yeah, just an example of what I've used the Object Properties tab for before. Otherwise, again, there's a lot of things here, but you just don't need to worry about them to begin with. They're just more complex, and they're specifically about the object properties, like how light's gonna interact with it and things like that. So like you can make them visible to the camera. For example, where is it? Or so you can change how it's rendered. So sometimes if you wanted to make a bowl of gas, for example, and you didn't want it to, but you had a bowl of gas around another object, but you were still modeling, so you wanted it in this view, and in this view, the bowl, whether this is gas or not, it's always going to look like this, unless you could come down here and change it to wire. Then you can still model your object that's inside gas without that object getting in the way, for example. Let me just put that back. Yeah, so that's object properties. You won't really worry about it at first. There's nothing important here to begin with. But the next tab, modifiers, is very important. It's probably the tab on here you'll come to the most, other than the materials tab. So shapes in Blender are controlled by the mesh, which is, this is the mesh. It's controlled by these vertices connected by edges. That's what controls the shape of your objects. And modifiers, at least most of them, affect your mesh or the shape as a whole. And there's a lot of modifiers here, and they do a lot of different things. But you, to begin with, like a lot of the other stuff, don't need to worry about knowing how to use all of these. I probably only know how to use maybe 50%. And there's a lot, like for example, none of these I've touched. A lot of these are for really complex animation type stuff where like vertex weight proximity is about when two objects get close to each other, parts of the mesh can change based on the settings you put within there, because it's about the vertexes, so the vertex of the mesh, and how they interact with each other as they get close. But it's for more complex animated stuff, and so you don't need to worry about it. The ones you do need to think about, probably the one you'll use for almost every shape, is subdivision subsurface modifier. And I'll go more into how it's used and what it does and how it works after I finish going through these, but just to give like an example of what it does to a shape. When you apply it, it basically smoothens, well, tries to smooth everything out. So if I apply it to this shape, you see it's taken every hard edge and every corner and averaged them down, basically. It takes, because that's what it does, it takes the edges and then averages the distance between them to give you the curve of that. So right now, obviously this curve here is averaging between those four edges, and so that's why you get that curve, basically. And I'll go into like how we control the shape based on this modifier again after I finished all of these, and I talk about how to manipulate shapes in the space like that. So yeah, we'll just take that off for now. Actually, before I take it off, it has levels, just kind of like everything. And you can turn them up, and then it basically just adds more vertices and smoothens the shape out more to give you nice smooth edges, which is why you'll probably use this for almost every shape, because nothing really has perfectly hard edges unless you're on purpose making a very hard edge shape. So you're going to always kind of want to use this modifier to make your shapes look nicer. Alright, so let's get rid of that. And yeah, so the modifiers I'll just teach as I use them to show how I do different like shape building, basically. But for now, we'll just move on to the physics tab. So the particle tab. So there's a new system in Blender for doing the kind of things you can do with the particle tab, and it's called the geometry nodes, but I haven't actually used geometry nodes yet. And so I'm probably not going to teach how to use particles. I'm just going to learn geometry nodes and teach that. But particles are just particles. There's two types: emitter, which emits particles. So right now it's just the base settings, and it's just pumping out these balls. And you can have it set these balls to be anything. Like you can model something and then set it to render these particles as that thing that you've modeled. So like a raindrop or I don't know, a dog, like whatever you want. And then the other one is hair, which is hair. So I don't know if Geometry Nodes does hair. So if you want to do hair, then you still will need to use the particle settings, and hair is like has a lot of settings. And I'm not that great at hair, but like I know how to use it, so I can teach it ish if people want it. But it really hair a lot comes down to kind of talent, because you literally have to comb the hair in Blender to make it look how you want. So if I increase this to just 30,000 hairs, the way that you make the hair look how you want is you go on to, where is it, particle edit, and you literally comb the hair into the direction and the shape that you want it to be in, basically. Sure. Yeah. Sorry, my girlfriend just asked me if I want some food, and I said yes. But yeah, so if you want hair, it kind of a little bit, like there's obviously some tricks to make it a bit easier, and certain of the hair manipulation tools like you can use to make things look better, but it really just comes down to practice and getting good at how you move the hair around. And I'm not that good at it. It's really hard. But yeah, if someone wants to learn more about hair, I can talk about the settings at some point, but I'm not going to do that right now anyway. So yeah, next tab is the physics tab. Oh, let's just get rid of these hair because that just looks weird. So yeah, the physics tab is based mostly for animations, because for still images, unless you're doing a simulation to get something like flowing water or a cloth on like a bed, for example, then you probably won't use the physics tab very much, because it's for like controlling collision forces, like how bouncy objects are. You can create force fields for like wind, for example. Like on the Cosmiqs pre-reveal image, I used a wind force field to blow the particles of the Cosmiqs image, the logo falling apart. You can make things soft instead of rigid, like so there's soft body physics and hard body physics. Soft body physics and hard body physics, and then obviously there's fluid simulations as well. And again, this is kind of needs its own video to explain any individual one of how to do those, but that's where it is, and so that's what that tab is if you're curious, basically. And I mean, if you want to go in and play around, just search up soft body tutorial like YouTube, and there'll be 100 videos. Like, or I mean, ask me, because I've done a bit of it too. If you don't want to go look for a video, I don't mind. Yeah. So 1 second, I'm just tying up my hair. Yeah, so the next one is object constraints. So the only thing in object constraints I've used is track 2. Again, this is more for animation and film type, like when you're making longer films, because it's about, like for example, track 2 is you can track to a camera to an object, so it follows the object. Or if you just want to check multiple angles, you can track to. If I track, so now I have the camera selected, I did that object constraint, use the picker, and I'm just going to click this object, and now wherever I move the camera, it's fixed on that object. So you can like kind of check out multiple camera angles like that if you want. Whoa, that was weird. I'm just going to back that so it's on there, get rid of that. Yeah, that's the only thing at first you probably need to worry about in here, unless you want to start doing more kind of film style stuff where the camera's going to move through a scene or something like that. Okay, let's just come off the camera because the camera changes what's there. Alright, so the next one is, what's it called? I always forget. Object data properties. So again, this is a tab that you don't really need to worry about at all. There's nothing that important in here except for one setting to begin with that you'll want to use, which is, so I mean, you can see that this shape looks a little bit weird. Like compared to this one, the shading's all strange and the corners don't look right, and the light's basically affecting it really weirdly. And that's because of the normals. And so normals they're what control the texture of a flat surface, essentially. So you can have actual deformity of a shape, or you can have kind of simulated deformity, which is based on the normals. And right now the normals are being weird because I added all of these extra edges instead of like this where all the edges only have a vertex on the actual edge of the shape, whereas here they're obviously not. Like this edge is just in the middle of a face instead of being on an edge, so the normals are getting messed up. So what you can do is come into this tab, go into normals, and click auto smooth, and then it basically gets rid of any weird shading artifacts like that on shapes. But other than that, here the only other thing is probably vertex groups. So certain things like well, particles. So when you want, if you want hair in a specific spot, you need to use vertex groups. So if I I think I should be able to quickly. There's not many vertices on this, so it's gonna be hard to show, but I will try. If we had hair on this, but we only wanted it to be on this top part and not this bottom part, what we can do is use the vertex groups essentially. So the vertexes, like I said, are the points that make up our mesh. So if we go into what's called transparent, or no, it's called X-ray mode by clicking this button, then just highlight everything here. And again, I'll talk about how to manipulate the space later after I finish going through, but I just, have to do it to show off some of the stuff. So yeah, we make this, actually, I only want the top half because we only want it to be on the top. Oh, it's actually a small trick you can do when you have stuff highlighted in Blender. Right now I want this top part, not this whole thing, but actually I do want these four as well. But yeah, if you're in a situation like this where you actually want the opposite of what's highlighted, you can press Control I and it inverts your selection. So yeah, now I have these vertexes highlighted. I'm going to create a vertex group by pressing this plus and just name it just group 1. And then I'm going to click Assign. So now that assigns those vertexes to this group. And now if we go out of transparent mode, go back to the particle settings and click on vertex groups and then on density and pick group 1. Now you'll see that the hairs are only up here because I've set them to only appear, like the density of the hairs is based on the vertex group of group 1, which was up there. So that's the other thing in the object data properties that you'll use close to the start, I guess, of when you get into Blender, is vertex groups. And then, yeah, the smoothing. Otherwise, don't really worry about the rest of this. Right, I'm just going to get rid of that and then get rid of the hair as well. Right, so the materials tab, that's obviously an important tab because it controls the materials of your objects. So when you're in this mode, which is called solid mode, so there's kind of 4 modes to view Blender in, which is the wireframe, solid, what's this one actually called? Shading mode? I don't know. I just call it colored mode because it's basically the same as solid mode, but with some color on your objects so you can see what they are. So if I change this to pink now, it's going to turn pink, and if I turn this to orange, it's going to turn orange. And then there's the fully rendered mode with like the lighting of your scene, basically, which I just want to bring the world a bit darker so we can actually see the lighting. Make that smaller. Yeah. Yeah, so materials. There's a lot of stuff you can do with materials. And like I said, it's controlled by, well, like I showed earlier, it's controlled by nodes. So this is a node. It's called the Principles BSDF, and it's kind of the base shader for Blender. That control, like, you're gonna use this for everything to begin with. There are a lot of other things that you can plug in to the final surface point, like glossy or transparent or emission for light. But to begin with, you're probably just gonna use this and mess around with these. So if I just make this shape, let's actually make more of a scene so I can show things off a bit more nicely. If we have a floor and some walls, it'll just look nicer and a bit more light. Let's just turn that up to 500. Get one more light in. Actually, let's just make walls. Why? Oh, click the wrong button. explain how I obviously did all of that stuff right after we finish these tabs. Yeah, so with materials, if I just make this smooth, it'll look a lot nicer. Shade it smooth.
Yo, chemistry, I need to go.
Okay, no worries, man.
But good work. Keep.
It'll be recorded, so you can always come back and watch if you want.
Okay, nice, bro.
Yeah.
Good work, bro.
Thanks. If anyone has like questions at any point, by the way, just jump in and ask. I don't mind at all. Yeah, so materials. It's best for your computer if you kind of look at your materials in this mode instead of rendered mode. I mean, it depends on how powerful your computer is, but I have a pretty powerful computer, which is why this where'd it go? Why this mode isn't very laggy or anything. But if I just, for example, changed it from GPU to CPU, then it already gets quite a bit slower, as you can see. So for most people, you probably want to just do a lot of your material editing here, and then just quickly look here, see how it looks, and then you can just go back. But yeah, let's talk about all the settings. So everything here is essentially also here in the nodes, and the nodes kind of give you a lot more control. So that's why I do more of my shading here than here. This is more where you just can add new materials to an object, which I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, so you've got the base color. I'll just do it from here at first. You've got the base color, so that's obviously just the color, and you can control this by RGB values, by hue, saturation, value, which is just, you know, the light dark tone of the color. And I don't even know what this one is. Just never touch alpha, basically. Yeah, or you can hex code. So if you have a very specific color, you can just search up a hex code for that color and then paste it in here and get that color. I'll just leave it gray for now. So then there's the next one down is subsurface. So that's how strong the subsurface scattering is. So just to show this off, let's just get another light, area light, bring it up. Oh, RX. Oh, what's happening? Okay. RX. This HUD should help show this off. I hope, anyway. So subsurface scattering is just light, how light enters an object and bounces around, like with human skin. When you shine light through it, it goes red. It doesn't just bounce off the skin. There's the light, you know, goes inside and bounces around a bit. Just turn that up. So you can change how much this happens, which you can kind of see here with this light coming through this shape. If I turn it all the way up to 1, obviously it's going through quite a lot. Turn it down and you kind of can't really see it anymore, but it's still different to having it completely off. And most of the time when you use subsurface scattering, you only want to use a tiny bit. For most materials and objects, if you put too much, it just ends up looking weird, kind of out of place and waxy. I mean, if you want wax, then it's actually really good, but otherwise, you use I usually keep it below 0.1 for most things. Yeah, so that's subsurface. And then the subsurface radius is kind of the color of the subsurface scattering. So as you see here, if I put it to 1, it's kind of definitely towards like a red color, and that's because these are the RGB red, green, blue values, and so it's got a 1 on red right now. So if I change that to 0.2, you see the red color kind of disappears, and if I bring up the middle one, it kind of goes green because I've turned up the green value within the subsurface. So yeah, that's kind of subsurface, which it definitely helps make certain objects look more realistic, like food, obviously skin, clothes, fabric, the stuff that you would expect to have some sort of like light being able to enter it and bounce around. And so yeah, and as well as being able to control the color of the subsurface through those RGB values there, you can actually just set the color, but they'll still be, if you set it to anything but red, it's going to have a slight red tint still if that red value is still set to 1. So if you don't want red, make sure you remember to change that. If you're wondering why there's like a kind of weird red tint to your objects and you have subsurf on, that's probably why, because you've got that set to 1. So subsurface Ior, you can just kind of not touch this. It's set to a good value, and I wouldn't bother messing with it. But it's the instance of refraction, and it's to do with how deep the light can enter the object. So I mean, if you want to mess around with it with an object, just go play around with it. Subsurface anisotropy is to do with how light enters an object through different directions. So if you've got light entering this way versus this way, it's going to be able to penetrate through different amounts. Anisotropy, that's basically what it is. It's a difference in direction. So yeah, like light entering here might be able to go halfway through, but from entering from this side, it can only enter, a few inches or something. Metallic is kind of self-explanatory. It makes things look metallic. So if I turn that all the way up.
Sorry for being late.
Yeah, no worries. It's all good. If you have any questions at any point, just don't feel free to ask. Oh, sorry, I just want to get a sip of water real quick. Oh. Yeah. So yeah, metallic. Just make things look metallic, basically. And then you can make it look more metallic by, well, at least shiny metallic anyway, by reducing the roughness. Because that's another slider. It's just roughness, which again, kind of self-explanatory, changes how rough things are, but it's a flat roughness. So if you want to add actual kind of rough texture, you have to do that in other ways, which I'll get to a bit later. Yeah, roughness, metallic, specular and specular tint. I've never touched those. I just wouldn't mess with them. I'm not actually even sure what they do, so I'm not going to comment on them and make you think something incorrect, because I'm not smart enough to know right now. So yeah. Anisotropic is, again, it's to, like I said with the subsurface, it's to do with how light hits different surfaces of the object, and instead of being just simply this side, it's to do with how the curve the surface is and how light reflects off it. But it's something that I haven't really messed with at all. But you can kind of see as it changes. It's just changing how the curves are treated and how light interacts with them. Anisotropic rotation is just then affects where the curve, how the anisotropy affecting the curve is. Like you can see, it's just kind of rotating around 360 degrees there. So it can give some cool effects for metallic objects, but I wouldn't use it for anything but metallic. If you do want to mess around with this, just to, I guess, give some variation to the metals if you have metals in your scene. But otherwise, just leave them at 0. I'm also going to bring the metallic back down. Sheen is to do with the reflectivity of your surface, but the roughness has way more effect on that, so I would worry about roughness a lot more than sheen, and just kind of don't worry about it to begin with. Same with sheen tint and clear coat. Again, I've never even touched it, so I wouldn't worry about it. And then therefore clear coat roughness. If you don't worry about clear coat, you don't need to worry about clear coat roughness. I think it's to do with like an additional surface on top of your surface. So if you have a rough surface, you can have a clear reflective surface on top of it, I believe. But I don't know, there's a lot more interesting things you can do with shaders other than just change these, which I'll talk about later, that give you a lot more creativity and options with how your material looks. So just worrying about these simple sliders is not the most important thing. There's a ton of other nodes and shaders and things you can add. Like, just a quick example, if I wanted to add stripes, I'll just search wave texture, get what's called a color ramp. No, not a vertex color. A color ramp. Plug that color into the base color. Plug the wave, not wavelength, I wanted wave texture. Wave texture. Plug that color into the factor. And then boom, you got stripes. And then you can control their color through the color ramp. Like so, and you can add like new colors in between, and then you can, if you want to, again, I'll go into like what I'm doing and how I'm doing this a bit later. This is just a quick example. If I just quickly add this, and then let's just move this over so I can see. So this is nodes. Like, these are what nodes look like. So right now I'm building a node tree for this texture. And just quickly just show off, I guess, some of the stuff, things you can do. So you can make something stripy and then affect those stripes with another node to change how they work, and then you can create a little kind of gizmo to affect how that affects the other texture. What do I want to mix RGB? So, and I'll talk about how I plug these things together and what it kind of means later. But so yeah, then right now I've got that wave stripe texture I have, and this is a noise texture, so it adds just noise. And then I added a mixing node to then decide how much of that noise I want applied to those waves. So like, this is how I've made some of the textures for the cosmic planets, for example. Yeah, I got a bit on a small tangent there from the clear coats, but moving on with the shape, I'm just going to unhook this to get rid of that. So the next one, which if you ever want to do glass or water, transmission is important. So you pretty much want this either on 0 or 100, unless you want to do like a kind of fogged glass type thing. So yeah, if you turn that all the way up, and then I turn roughness, oh, I don't want to lock that, turn it all the way down, you see then this basically just turns into a glass block. And if you bring up the roughness a little bit, then it becomes kind of like fogged glass. And so obviously there's some really cool stuff you can do with this. And one, I guess, thing to remember about glass is glass in Blender can only be rendered with cycles. So if your computer struggles with cycles and you have to use Eevee, then you're not really going to be able to do glass, because Eevee can't compute the way that light bounces through glass, basically. So, like, I mean, I always use cycles because it's just better, but Eevee is still great, and you can do a lot with it, except glass, pretty much. But yeah, glasses are cool, and you can do a lot of stuff with glass. And I think we should still be able to, if I plug this in, it should still be, yeah, it's still kind of glass. It's just very dark blue glass. Yeah, transmission.
Hey, bro, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?
Oh, hey, if you have some time, do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Yeah, for sure. I said earlier, at any point anyone has questions, just go for it.
Oh, copy that. So I was just wondering, so is this is pre-recorded, or this will be recorded, I mean, right?
Yeah, this time I mean, I recorded it last time and I'm recording it again this time, except this time I am definitely recording my mic, because last time I accidentally had my mic muted, so it was a long recording,
Okay.
but with no sound.
Oh, okay. And then I was just wondering, what would be the best way to remove the background for my Cosmiqs?
I mean, if you have like Photoshop, obviously a software like that's going to be the best. There's some online Photoshop like copies. I can't remember what they're called. They're really good. There's also, if you just Google like for things like that, sometimes I've just Googled like background remover. I mean, also if you have a more specific one and you really want it clean PNG, you can just send it to me and I can make it for you.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I might hit you up then.
Yeah, because
I've been having a lot of trouble.
Yeah, because I still have obviously all the files, so I can just render your exact one, your mix of traits with no background.
Okay, okay. Well, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, just
that's it for me.
DM me that if you want that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah. So where was I? Transmission. I'll turn that. I'll just leave it on. Glass is cool. Transmission roughness. I've never actually touched this. I prefer to just control it through the amount of transmission and the amount of roughness, because they can kind of do that anyway. So I just don't touch transmission roughness. And other cool things you can do with glass is, like, again with nodes, you can, let's just duplicate this noise texture and get a color ramp. Like I'm just in terms of roughness right now. Just if I plug this into the roughness and then plug in the noise texture, and then I'm just gonna look at the noise texture specifically. Oh, what? Why is that? I want this. Yeah. Now this glass has like some perfectly clear parts and some really rough parts. So it's like a kind of frosted or dirty glass. It's just a cool thing you can do instead of using like this roughness and whatnot. Yeah, but anyway, back to the list. So the next thing is emission. So when you want things to glow, like so, let's make this glow inside the glass. There is an entire shader of this for emission, so you could click here and go to the emission shader. Where is it? Emission. So then it's literally just the color and the strength of how much this glows. But you don't need to use that. You can just stick with the principled BSDF and decide the color. So if you make it green and then turn it up, like it's basically this is the emission shader. It's just within this one now. I think because in older versions of Blender, they didn't have the principled BSDF, and emission was just its own thing. And then when they added it in, they just didn't get rid of the emission one because you can still use it to like to mix with other shaders. And instead of having this entire big node in the tree every time you just wanted a bit of emission, you can still just have that small one that I showed. All right. Yeah, so that's just emission and strength. And that makes things glow. But it makes things glow, but they don't look incredible in renders glowing until you add some glare to it, which I can talk about later when I actually render something, because that's with the compositing nodes, so I'm not going to go into it right now, but yeah, I just wanted to mention it. The rest of this in the materials I would not worry about at all right now. Some of these have to do with when you're building bigger node trees with more elements to them. There's certain settings down here that you have to turn on. Just for example, if I wanted to add displacement to this object, so I didn't want it to be this perfectly smooth faced shape, and I wanted it to have some bumps or something, one way you can do that is displacement. So in here, if you add a displacement node, and again I'll talk about how you add nodes and stuff in here after I've gone through all these tabs, so we're almost there. Yeah, if I just connect that, well, actually, so what I can do, this is something you can do, if I wanted this to be bumpy in the same places that it's clear and rough, you can use the same texture to drive two things. So if I plug that back into the roughness, and we got some of that rough faces back on the glass, and then I also plug that into the displacement. At first it doesn't really do much because we don't have displacement turned on. So like I said, for some of these things you have to turn on settings down here. So for displacement, you go to settings, you go to surface, and then instead of bump only, you want displacement and bump. And then now you see that noise texture. So if we look at just the noise texture, I'll just unhook the displacement. Again, I'll talk about how I'm doing like this to look specifically at the noise texture. But that's what the noise texture looks like. It's these just like white, gray areas, and then it displaces based on the strength of the color being white or gray, with the gray bits or the darker staying in and the brighter get poked out like that. Yeah, so you can get some really kind of cool, weird looking stuff with displacement. And then obviously you can just completely change the scale with the sliders and level of detail. And like this is how you add actual roughness to shapes other than just sliding the roughness, or at least it's one way. Yeah, so that's and to be honest, with all of these additional settings down here, that's one of the only ones you really need to worry about and remember is turning on your displacement. And another thing with displacement, if you do use it, just so that you don't have what I'm about to say happen and be like, what? Why is it not working? You can only see displacement in the rendered mode. So like if you put displacement here, obviously you can't see it. If you put it here, you can kind of see it. It like tries to show you, but it's not quite. Yeah, only in rendered mode. So in the past, like when I was starting out, I'd be putting it on and being like, why can't I see it? Why is it still all flat? But it was working, just, yeah, it's only in rendered mode. Alright, so that's kind of the last thing, yeah, for the materials tab. So the only other tab here that's kind of a default tab is this texture tab. And I've not used this tab for anything but the other way that you do displacement. So I just showed the one way to do displacement for an object. The other way to do it is with modifiers. So I talked about the modifier tab earlier and how that modifiers basically control your mesh in a way. So one of the modifiers is displace. So when you just turn on the displacement modifier, it doesn't know what it's displacing based off, so it just displaces everything, and it just always makes it bigger like that. So then what you have to do is click on new, and it then brings up texture, and then that's when you go down to this like texture tab, and then make a new texture, which it already has for you when you click that in the displacement, and then you would pick what texture you want. So the one I usually use is clouds, and again, this is a lot of, I guess, really specific stuff about displacement that I can go more into in detail in another tutorial. But just wanted to show what this tab is mainly used for. It's controlling textures for displacement, at least for me. That's what I've mainly used it for. And yeah, you can control the size of the texture, which obviously controls how that texture is displacing your mesh of your shape. And you can control the strength in the modifier. So you can, yeah, just have a tiny bit or a lot and get some funky shapes. Again, how I got some of the displaced shapes for the cosmic planets as well. Alright, so that's pretty much all of these tabs. There's only a few others that pop up, but only when you have certain things selected. So for example, when you pick up a light, you get this lighting tab, which basically just, you know, it lets you control the color of your light, which, yeah, you can control the color. So I often give like a slight warm tone to my lights, just make them a little like yellowy orange, just make scenes look a little bit nicer compared to like just a perfectly white. Or you can go a bit like tiny bit blue, for a certain, you know, more of a, I guess, sad feeling. And yeah, just the power of the light. Obviously, you can go 0 to like 10,000 and just have like, you know, super bright lights. Which there's cases where you want to do if you know want to simulate the sun. I mean, I would just use the sun lamp in that case, which just simulates the sun. But yeah, you can do, you know, whatever you want there. Just do 1,000 for now. And yeah, you can change the size of the lamp, but you can also do that with the normal size control settings, which I'm about to get to in a second. And other, you know, specific things like whether you want shadows cast from this light or not. So like you can see here, there's a slight shadow, and the shadow is hard to see because of that emission and the fact that this light is so big it creates a soft shadow, but then you can see it more. And then yeah, you can turn off shadows from a specific light, which can be very useful actually for lighting like an object. If you want really nice lighting for this, for example, if I was to turn off the emission anyway because it's super bright, you're gonna want probably a light like one light coming here, one light coming from the back, one light coming there, and then if your camera then has the floor in it and you've got just like a shadow here, a shadow there, a shadow there, it doesn't look very nice. So you can turn off, you know, 2 of those shadows, still have the lighting on your object, but no shadow mess on the floor below it. Which, that's one thing which I guess shows a bit more knowledge in your art in like 3D when you do or don't have that shadow mess below a character, which is something I've like kind of see in 3D NFT collections, and it gives me a little bit of, I guess, insight into the experience of the artist. Because yeah, if you don't put it, you just get a mixture of shadow directions, and it doesn't look as nice as just one, you know, kind of uniform shadow. Yes, that's probably the only things here I've touched is whether you want shadows, the color, and the strength. Oh, and the shape. Sometimes you might want the reflection to be not a square, so it's set to square. You can also change it to disk, because you might want your reflections, like maybe in someone's eye, you want a nice circular highlight on the pupil, for example. Yeah, so that's the only things in light. So the only other tab that is not here normally is the camera settings, because you have to have the camera selected. So that just changes yeah, so you can change the type of camera. So right now it's on perspective, which is just normal. So if it's the standard setting, so I'm just going to rotate down a little. Whoa, down a little bit. And you can imagine, you know, if you've traced that line and then that line of that edge is back, they'd come to a single point. So that's perspective. But there's also orthographic, which then just makes everything perfectly flat. And this is used for the rooms. I don't know if everyone's seen the small 3D images of rooms. I'm just gonna show an example so you know what I'm talking about. So like if you wanted to make the things like this, these are made always with the orthographic camera because of the way that it's just the style that it makes it look cool in, basically. Because with perspective, it just doesn't look nearly as good as orthographic. So yeah, that's. And then the other one is panoramic, which is basically just fisheye. So I mean, for stylistic choice, it's the only time you'd use this, I guess, or if you're building like a game scene or something and you want to check it out from this kind of view, because that's kind of how first-person game views are done, but zoomed in. Yeah, so that's that. Obviously, then there's focus. So these from here, it's basically camera settings. So if you have a specific camera setting you want, you can just perfectly match it in here, basically with same with the depth of field. So that's the only things I touch in here is whether I'm using this, the focal length of the camera, and then whether I want depth of field or not, which is just, you know, just blurring the background or not, basically. And you can control how much of the background is blurred or whether you just want it focused on a specific object. So if I wanted to focus on this cube, you just turn on depth of field, pick up the little dropper, click on that object, and now the focus will be here. It's hard to see right now because of the noise, but I can enhance it by turning the f-stop down. I mean, now you can kind of see like that edge of the room, and this is kind of blurred, but we're still focused on the cube. So obviously that can be used to make some really nice images, depth of field. Right, so that's basically all the tabs. That's all the stuff here that you need to worry about to begin with. That was a lot of information. So obviously if you have any questions at any point, just like when you're creating stuff, just drop them down in the Blender help channel in here, and I'll answer them as soon as I get a chance to. But so now, how do you actually do stuff in Blender? Because it's all well and good knowing what this is, but how do I move, and how do I move an object and, you know, make shapes and whatnot? So let's go back to the modeling tab, put it in solid mode. Let's just get rid of this for now. Just move it out of the way. And our weird object. Alright, so the way you shift around in Blender, when you first open it, it's the middle mouse button, your scroll wheel button, and that's how you rotate around the world. But I have mine set to my like side mouse button because that's just more comfortable for me. And if you do want to change any of the key bindings, the way you do it is go to Edit, Preferences. I'd make it a bit bigger. Then just go into Key Map, 3D View. Where is it? 3D View Global. And then the ones for rotating and panning is just here. So just rotate and pan view. So I have mine on button 5 mouse because that's my side button. And then for actually moving around the world, like this, panning through the world instead of just rotating, you just pick. Well, so to begin with, it'll be Shift middle mouse, but for me, I've put a Shift like side mouse button. So yeah, you can either set that what you want, or if you're comfortable with the middle mouse, just keep it as that. So yeah, middle mouse to rotate, Shift middle mouse to pan. So that's how you move around. So the way you spawn anything in Blender, including in shaders as well, so when you're spawning the extra shaders or objects, you're going to press Shift A. That's how you spawn something. What do I have highlighted? And yeah, so make sure when you're spawning something new that you don't have anything else selected. Because if I have this selected and I spawn something new, I didn't know I was going to do that. It moved that object there. I don't know why that happened, but especially if you have it selected and you're in edit mode. So, and the way you, I should have said that first, but whatever. So there's 2 modes for when you're modeling. Object mode, which is basically just for grabbing and moving things, and there's edit mode, which is how you actually access the mesh and move it around. And if you spawn a new object while you're in edit mode on another object, so if I'm in edit mode with this cube, and then I spawn a circle, these are now one object. So when I click the cube, it moves that circle. When I click the circle, it moves the cube. So most of the time you probably don't want to do that. So make sure wait, before you're spawning something, just click off into space to make sure there's nothing, and then you're gonna click Shift A, and that brings up the menu for all the different things you can spawn. So obviously there's meshes, you can spawn planes. Why is it snapping this object to the middle? I don't know why it's doing that. Yeah, so you can spawn planes, which is usually how I, start building a scene with a plane. The simplest scene for like making rendering an object out is to just make a plane, go into edit mode. So you can either go into edit mode by, you have your object selected, you can come up here and click go to edit mode, or it's just the tab button goes into edit mode. And then so then you want to select the back two vertices, and the way you select vertices is either you can either click them, you can click and drag for like 2, or you can shift click. So if I shift click this one and then shift click this one, it'll click multiple. Or for selecting an edge, you can also alt click and then it'll select that edge for you. Yeah, so for building a nice little scene, usually just spawn a plane. So Shift A, spawn plane, then tab into edit mode, select those two, and then one thing you'll do basically all the time when you're modeling something is extruding. So when you have a part that you want to extrude, you then click E, and then that's going to make a new mesh from where you've selected, basically. So for this like common scene, people usually do that, and then if you click Z, it'll then lock that extrusion to the Z axis, so you can move it up. And then that's like a very basic backdrop, and you can smooth this out by again highlighting it, so you can do the alt click to highlight the edge, and then Control B will bevel things nicely, and you can then scroll to add more vertices inside. So Control B for bevel it's like doing like what I showed earlier with the Subsurface Division modifier, which makes our shapes kind of smooths out, well, tries to smooth out the shape overall. It's basically that, but on one edge. So if you only want to do it for one edge of a shape, like so if I only wanted this one edge of this cube, instead of subsurface subdivisioning it and making everything smoothened off into a curve, so I'll just get rid of that. If I just want it on one edge, I can highlight that edge. So either shift click or alt click the edge, highlight it, and then Control B, and then again you get that bevel, and you scroll to choose how smooth your curve is, basically. Yes, that's bevel. Oh, and it looks weird, and so that's right now. So there, I just did that bevel, and that messed with the normals of the shapes. That's now the case where I would come over here, like I said earlier, to the object data properties, and then auto smooth those normals, so it looks normal again. You can do the same thing for this shape, actually. Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, that was a bit of a ramble off of just a plane. But yeah, so spawning objects, Shift A, plane. You've got, why does it keep snapping this? I'm just going to delete this object because it's being weird. Oh, and deleting things. I mean, good example there. You want to delete something, highlight it. So click on it, make sure it's the thing you want. So when you're highlighting, it's the thing that's highlighted with that outline of orangey yellow. That's what you have. So to delete something, just click X and then delete. If you want to delete a specific part, you can do that in edit mode. So if I decide, like, if I don't want all of this, and for some reason I want to leave a hole just like this in this shape, they're now highlighted. So I'm going to click X and then vertices. But, oh no, it deleted the whole shape. So that's not how you want to delete vertices to make a hole, for example. So like before, it was just X delete as one option. But with vertices, there's a lot of different ways you can delete stuff. So in this case, if we wanted to just delete what's here and not get rid of these faces too, we don't want to delete the vertices, because if we delete the vertices, right now, this vertice and this vertice are part of that face, so that's why it disappeared, and then they're all part of this face, for example. So what we want to choose in this case would be X and then delete faces, because only those faces were selected, basically. And you can kind of see that, how those faces have been highlighted orange and nothing else has. So since we just want that deleted, we delete faces. If you just wanted to get rid of like an edge, there's an option for that too. So if we just want this edge, you dissolve edge, and it remakes the face without the edge there. And if we delete edge, then it gets rid of, you know, the faces that that edge was a part of, if that makes sense. So make sure, like, because like that can be confusing at first when you're deleting and you're clicking the wrong delete buttons. Just basically know that it does matter which one you click. So if you're confused as to why you're deleting more than you want, just try one of the other ones basically. And dissolve basically tries to keep as much of the shape there as possible, whereas delete will just get rid of anything that like face or vertex is connected to, essentially. Right. Yeah, so again, I'm not just going to actually spawn every shape and then just ramble after that. So yeah, cube, circle, there's a few different types of spheres. You've got the UV sphere, which comes from a point at the top and a point at the bottom, and then a bunch of squares in between, basically. And then there's also the quadrosphere, which is slightly better for certain things, as it's a bunch of polygons. It's triangles instead of squares, so textures are sometimes apply better on here because it doesn't have, because of like normals, like I was talking about before, where your shading can get weird because of how the normals are affected by the mesh or the modifiers, because right now this one's being affected by the subsurface and giving us this weird shading until we smooth the normals and it looks more how it should. Because the mesh on here goes from bigger to much smaller and condenses into a point, textures can be applied strangely sometimes on UV spheres, so you might want to use an icosphere instead. The icosphere is also useful to explain that for most objects there are some settings when you first spawn it. So after I spawn this icosphere, you can see down here you've got some settings for the subdivisions. So in the case of the icosphere, it's how small the triangles are to change how smooth the surface is. And then the radius, so that's just the size basically, and then where it is, but that's, you don't need to worry about that there. And yeah, once you set these and then move the shape, that's it. These are locked in. So make sure these are what you want before you click anything else, because as soon as you now click, now that shape is now locked in as that. So the only one that I've really worried about that for is the icosphere, for how many faces I want, and cylinders. So with a cylinder, you might not want, maybe you don't actually want a cylinder, you want like a long triangle. So you can do that by bringing the faces down to 3, or however many you want. You want an octagon shape, obviously put it at 8. Yeah, so just make sure for any of the settings, shapes like that, where you do want to change what you start with, because I mean, when you're modeling stuff in Blender, you want to start with a shape as close as possible to whatever you're modeling. So if you want to model something that has 8 sides, start with a shape that has 8 sides. So yeah, that's where you would set that. The other one is probably the torus, because you can change the overall size, but then also how thick the torus is here. And it's a lot easier to do it now than later on, basically. But there is a way to do it later on, which I'll come to. Right, so that's how you spawn objects, but how do we move objects? Because that's probably pretty important. So yeah, once you have something in and you have it selected, the way you pick it up and move it around is G. So you click G to move it. It's going to move in whatever plane you're looking at. So if I'm looking down the Y plane and I move it somewhere, it's going to have moved perfectly, you know, along the X-axis basically, or along the XZ axis. Or if I look down the X, then it's going to, you know, perfectly move sideways. But if I look in some random axis, then that's the plane that it's going to move down. So the way that I like to move things in Blender, because there's a few ways you can do it. You can try and just, you know, constantly move your view around to get it into the exact spot you want. You can turn on the gizmos, I think they're called, yeah, object gizmos. So move, for now, move. So if we turn on that one, you can then just pick this arrow up for the Y-axis, X-axis, Z-axis to move it around. I don't like using gizmos though. Or you can just click G and then Y to move along the Y. Yeah, GX for X and GZ for Z. Or you can also exclude axes. So if I only want to move it on, so for example, if I wanted this shape on the floor here, like, and I want, so like I lined it up so it's perfectly on the floor, but I just want it to be like here, not here, but I still want it to be in this plane. What I can do is do G, Shift Z, and now it will only move in the XY plane, and it won't move in the Z plane. So that, yeah, that can be pretty useful. So you can do the same thing for G, Shift Y. Now it's only going to move in that XZ plane. Yeah. Yeah, so other than moving, you're going to want to rotate things, obviously. So you can guess that would be R. So have your object selected, click R. And again, wherever you're looking, if you just click R and do it, it's just going to rotate down, straight down the axis that you're looking at. So if you want to rotate it specifically, again, just RY will do Y-axis, RXX, and RZZ. You can also just kind of randomize the rotation. If you just double tap R, then you can just move your mouse, and it's just sort of random, but you can control it a bit as well. It's an easy way to randomize like the rotation of like 3 or 4 things in your scene. Just double tap R and just wiggle, wiggle, done. Yeah, I'm just going to back that so it's nice and flat still. And the other thing is obviously size. You want to change the size. So again, you can probably guess that's just S. So if you click S and then you drag, you get bigger and smaller. And just like the rest of them, you can do it along a certain axis. So SY is going to do the Y-axis, SZ, Z, and so on. And again, you can exclude. So if I want this to go taller and thicker this way, but not that way, then I can just do S, Shift Y, and it's going to get taller and longer in that direction, but stay the same that way. Yeah, that's like the basics of manipulating shapes around. But obviously that doesn't help you really model anything. So if we just bring in a square, I mean a cube, because that's probably the easiest thing to do. Shift. So yeah, Shift A. I'm gonna go to mesh. Oh yeah, well I should probably talk about some of these other things actually. So yeah, meshes that's all the shapes basically, or anything. If you want to shape a solid shape, you're gonna want to mesh, and in here. If it's not in here, then you have to make it, or you'll be able to make it from one of these shapes basically. And there is some extras as well. So some of this stuff you won't have in yours, because in Edit and then Preferences and Add-ons, if you search Extra, this is something built in to Blender, it's just not turned on. You can turn on the extra mesh options, and it just gives a few more extra stuff. So like in Round Cube, there's a few extra shapes in here basically that you can just go kind of experiment with, or if you want them. Like the Quadrosphere is again better than the UV sphere, and maybe even slightly better than the Icosphere for textures, because everything is squares, and Blender prefers squares to triangles overall, essentially. Yeah, so there's curves. I haven't used any of these. The only thing I've used is just the Bezier curve, and it is essentially is a curve, and you manipulate curves by highlighting them. So this is our curve. You go into edit mode, and then you get these kind of 3-point slider like size things. So if you can highlight one side and move it around, and that affects where the curve happens relative to like this point and that point. Yeah, obviously you can move it, rotate your curves, extrude your curves. So click E, just like on a shape, which I was about to get to. If you want to make a face like stick out, you select your faces that you want to stick out. So just shift clicking those, and then you click E, and it extrudes that face and gives you, yeah, well, an extrusion. So, you know, legs, arms, noses, ears, like usually I make those by just extruding and then editing the mesh a little bit afterwards. And so same with the curve. You can extrude your curve and make more. And curves are cool for like piping and stuff like that, because you can curve out your pipe shape, for example, then going to the curve settings. So curve settings are one of these tabs that doesn't show up unless you have a curve. You can go in after you have the curve, go to geometry, and give it some depth, and it basically turns it into, you know, a pipe, or I mean whatever you want it to be. And then you can do the subsurface modifier on that to like give it some smoothness as well to make it a nicer curve. Yeah, so that's curves. What else we got? Surfaces. Never use surfaces. I wouldn't worry about them. Metaballs are pretty cool, but they have, I mean, a pretty specific use case. Like, you're not going to use metaballs for just general modeling. At least I haven't. I mean, you probably could for some things, but for clouds, for example, because you basically have a ball, you click Shift D, which is actually how you duplicate things, and then it makes a ball, and the metaballs kind of, yeah, interact with each other by filling the space, and you can change the resolution on them, how smooth they are. So you usually want it pretty low, so they're nice. Well, at least I want it nice and low, so they look smooth. And then you change the thresholds for how close they are and how much they combine, basically. Yeah, so metaballs are cool. Obviously, you can do some cool stuff with those if you want some goopy, floaty type stuff, or just like simple cartoon style clouds. They can be cool. But that's what all I've used them for. Just gonna get rid of them because they're in the way. That's metaballs. Text. Text is obviously just text. So when you spawn text, it's just like any other object. You click G to move it, like GY. So and instead of, when you go into edit mode, instead of it being the mesh, it's the text. So then you can just backspace and you can just then write whatever you want. If you do end up wanting to turn it into mesh at some point, you can basically click F3, search mesh, and the first one will come up with convert to mesh, and then it'll be a mesh. Although they're usually pretty bad meshes. Like, and what I mean by bad meshes is just the faces are all weird shapes. Like, this is just a really not a nice mesh. But if all you're doing is text and you want it colored and you just want it meshed, so you can maybe just, you know, move it around a little bit, then it works fine. Let's get rid of that. Oh, all of it. Go away. Oh, I could have just deleted it there. That would have been smarter. Yeah, so that's text. Volume, I wouldn't worry about volumes at first at all, basically. If you want smoke, or you want like some sort of smoky gasiness, you can do it through shading instead of worrying about spawning volumes. Like if I wanted this weird shape to be a gas ball. Oh yeah, I put the depth of field on, never took it off. Let's just take that off for a second. Yeah, if I wanted this to be a gas ball, you would just, in the materials, so after you select your object, go to the materials tab, give it a new material. In the shading nodes, you would disconnect the principal point, get rid of it, and then bring up volume. So just like I spawn shapes here with Shift A, here you spawn new stuff by doing Shift A, and then I usually just search for it instead of going and looking through the menus. You can search for a volume, principled volume, then you just plug the volume into volume, and then now you've got like a gas, basically. And you can change the density and the color. And if you want not like solid lines, then you can, you know, I can go into that later, or if someone can ask specific questions, because it's really specific to what you want to do with it, how you would affect this with other nodes. So yeah, I'll go back to here for now. What else we got? Grease pencil. So grease pencil is like super interesting, honestly. It's like Blender's 3D, 2D mix-up thing where you can plug in a drawing tablet and draw stuff, and it's actually a 3D stroke. So they're, you know, it's like a weird 3D, 2D type thing. And grease pencil is basically what it's called in Blender. Yeah, I'm gonna get rid of those. Yeah, what else in this menu? Armature. So armature is about rigging. If you're gonna want to get into rigging characters for like animation, then that's like a whole like video like like learning process to get it right. So I'm not going to go into it now. Basically, there is an add-on in Blender. It's like, so if you really want to get into rigging and like your whole goal is to make characters, animate them, then what I would do is start and learn with the Rigify add-on. So there's an add-on in Blender which basically, I haven't actually used it yet. I've just watched some videos and I want to start using it. But it creates a rigged skeleton for you, and you just have to fit it to your character, and it's got everything else done for you, and then you can kind of start animating from there. So if you want to start rigging, that's where I would do it. Let's take off this pencil. Lattice, I've never touched. I think it just, you can create a grid. I think that might be basically it. Empty, don't worry about it. The only thing I've used in empties is the actual empty, and you can use this because it's invisible in the scene, so you can use it as a focus point for your camera if you want. Or sometimes I've used it as a rotation object if I want something else, like if I wanted this to rotate in the scene, and like maybe 4 other things, you can parent them. So parenting is something that's useful in Blender, where if you click an object, then you click what you want to be the parent, then you click Control P and keep transform. Now anything this empty does, that object will also do. So if I animated that to rotate, that would also rotate without me having to animate this. So if I had 4 things or 5 things and I wanted them to just all go in a circle, I could just parent them all to this, animate this one thing instead of all 5 of them, basically. And then to get rid of a parent, you can click on the object and click Alt P and then clear parent, and that gets rid of it. But bear in mind, if you do that, it'll go back to wherever you had it before you started the parent. Alright, so other than that, there's lights. So I talked a bit about lights earlier. I usually use area lights. The other ones are more specific. So a spotlight is like a spotlight. The sun's just bright, and a point is just a circular point in space that is a light. Is this making that much light in our scene? Yeah, it is. Yeah, so the point light is just a circular light point, basically. Yeah, so I like using areas the most because they kind of give the most directional and size and sharpness control, essentially. Other than that, camera is probably the only other thing to worry about here. So, yeah, so that's how you spawn a camera. I would, like I was saying to someone at the start, if you want to spawn a camera, look down an axis, then spawn your camera. That way, when you then want to move it, it's perfectly along the x-axis, so I can click GX and move it, and now I know it's perfectly facing the center, so I can rotate it like wherever I want, and it's just gonna be better than if it was like just like looking here, because I was looking like this when I spawned it, because now that's gonna be a lot harder to get into position, basically. Yeah, so that's all that. Let's like just make a random shape, showing you some modeling stuff. Let's bring in a cube. What's the time? Oh wow, it's 12:40. What time did I start? 11. Yeah. Yeah. So making a shape. Most of the time, like I said before, you're not going to want a hard shape. So because of that, because you're going to most of the time subdivide stuff anyway, I usually just subdivide them straight away. And I honestly start at least 50 to 60% of the things I make from a cube. And then if it really doesn't work, I'll move to something else. But yeah, so I'll usually subdivide, turn the render up to 4 just so it's set, so then I don't forget for later. So in the actual final render, it will be like, it would look like that right now. And then I'll usually put the viewport to 2, just so I can, and then in object mode, so not in edit mode, not with the vertices up, in object mode, right click when you have the object selected and click shade smooth, and it'll, shade it smooth, basically get rid of all of those hard edges, auto smooth it, just so it removes any artifacts, and then I'll start modeling, because it'll be easier to see kind of what it is, what it looks like, versus, if I wanted a shape like, let's say I wanted this for some reason. I wanted this weird shape. this is on 0, that's what it looks like, and it doesn't really help me see if I've got what I want or not. Whereas if you put this up a little bit, you can actually see, oh, okay, yes, I've got the shape I want. Let's get rid of all of those, because I should show how to do those. Yeah, so the main 2 or 3 things you're going to do when manipulating a shape are clicking Control R, which adds these edges, basically. So if you click Control R and then hover over your edge, it's going to give you option to add a new one there. And if you scroll, you can add more or less on that addition. So then once you click, it lets you slide it around, and you can kind of see how here the subdivision modifier works. So I leave it perfectly in the middle. It doesn't change much. But then if I move it over to this side, you see it makes this curve a lot sharper instead of really smooth like we have here. And that's because what the modifier is doing is taking those edges, this one, this one, this one, and this one, and averaging that distance to give us that curve, basically. So yeah, I could add another one. So yeah, Control R to add another one, put it here. Or no, let's say we want to make like an old style Mac, for example. We'd want one face to be like squarish, so we need to add some edges here to then make that, to make it a little more square. See, and then we could, so now we've got what would be like the face and the back. So that's one way to manipulate shapes, is just basically add edge loops where you want them. So if you want, a cube, so maybe you still wanted a cube. So you want a nice smooth edge, like curved cube, but you still want a cube. So in that case, what you do is just add edge loops to every single face on every side and push it right to the edge, so that when you're averaging now, the average, so now the average here is right one, like between those 3. So we still get a nice curve instead of a sharp edge, but it's a much tighter, sharper curve because we've made that averaging space really small. So when you still want sharp edges, basically, because like I said, nothing in the real world has a perfectly sharp edge, except maybe metal edges. I usually just do this to everything, even if it's a hard edge. Then I gave it just that slight curve can just make things look a little bit nicer. So yeah, so that's adding edge loops and kind of how they work. And yeah, if you like I said, if you click and drag, then you click to place it. If you just Control R, click, and then right click, it'll just place it right in that center point. Yeah.
Hey, just want to say this is amazing, dude.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad. Thank you. Yeah. So the other thing you'll do to manipulate a shape a lot is extrude. So I showed a bit of extrusion before with like that bit there, and extruding up the back here. But so you'll use a combination of, so if I wanted to give this box arms and legs, right, I'd use a combination of extruding and adding edge loops to do that. So if I wanted to give it arms, I'll probably put one here, one here, one here, and one here, and then I grab this face. And an easy way to grab faces than having to highlight all the vertices like that is there's 3 little buttons up here. So the first one here is vertice mode, so where we see each vertex. The middle one is edge mode, so then we can highlight the edges, so between 2 vertices. And then there's also face select, so then you can just do full faces. So like if I wanted arms, I'd click this face and this face, so shift click that face, so click and then shift click so that you're still highlighting both. And then you click E and S. Whoa, why is it going? Oh, we're going backwards. That's why. So yeah, when I just clicked E to begin with, it's extruding them, but it's extruding them along the Z-axis. That's why that blue line pop up in the middle. So because I want them to extrude out, I'm just clicking S to basically make it a scale extrusion. And then I only want them to go along the Y-axis, right? So we only want the arms to go this way. But at the moment, when I do ES, they're also getting bigger in like the Z-axis and the X-axis, but we just want, nice straight arms. So if you click E, S, Y, now, oh, is it not doing it? Oh, is it because I've only got one highlighted? ESY. Now we get them just extruding along that axis there. So we kind of get these arm shapes, but obviously they're very curved here. So what you would do is then do, again, Control R to go in, bring it closer so that there's less of a you know, big slope here, because again you're changing where it's averaging between. Instead of averaging between here, here, and here, you're averaging now just between those three, so it gives that nicer curve. So yeah, that's how I'd kind of put arms on this, for example, and then, you know, do the same thing for legs. Oh, let's just get this out of the way so we can see. But you've already got 2 lines there for the from the arm, so yeah, I would just like add, well, put one, scroll once to add 2 more, then in face select mode, so making sure you've got that clicked. Or you can also swap between these with numbers, so when you're in edit mode, if you click 1, it'll be vertices, 2 edges, and 3 faces. So yeah, then you just, you know, pick those up, E, and now that we want them in the Z axis, and I click E, it just automatically goes to Z, so that's fine this time. You know, we would just go down, and then again, you could just add your edge loops, and yeah, you got some weird box dude. But half of that was pointless, and you know, I shouldn't have done it. So instead of doing all of that, right, and doing everything on 2 sides, instead, just mirror it. So what you would do normally, or what you should do anyway, is before I started extruding arms and legs, I should have pressed Control R, put a vertex right in the middle, so don't click, just right click so it's in the middle to put that edge loop down the middle. Look down the x-axis, so with this little gizmo thing up here, if you just click the axis, you'll look down it. Go into transparent mode, so that's that button up here, and then highlight half of your object. So like this is something you want to do if you're making a symmetrical object. It's just a lot easier to mirror it than to try and edit both sides and make them perfect. So put something right down the middle. So if you're going to start from a cube, you can just do this right when you spawn the cube. Then delete half of it. So you want to do vertices to make sure. But then you also want to make sure that your object origin point, so this little orange dot is your object origin. So you'll see every object has this little orange dot when I click on them. So when you mirror something, it mirrors it based on where that orange dot is. So if it wasn't in this perfect middle point, the way to do that would be to highlight all of those vertices, and then you click Shift S and go to cursor to selected. And what that does is move this world cursor to whatever you have selected. And then what you can go do is, and this is a little bit complicated, but it's really useful for modeling anything symmetrical. So any character, any object that you know is symmetrical. So you know most things, to be honest, are symmetrical on some angle. You'll want to learn to do this. So you basically put the world cursor there, and then you go out of edit mode, right click with your object, and set origin to 3D cursor, and then that brings that orange point right there. So now I've just basically placed it perfectly on the middle of that object. So now when I go into the mirror and set it to the y-axis, because we want it to mirror on the y-axis, not the z, now we have this mirrored object, and anything you do, oh, and you want the mirror to be the start of your modifiers. So like the order of your modifiers does matter. And there's not much of a difference now with these two, but for some of them it will really change what your object looks like with the order wrong. And you want the mirror to be first, so it's mirrored, and then everything else happens. But yeah, now if I move something here, it happens on the other side too. So if I was to, you know, extrude a horn or something here, it's like if I wanted to turn this into an ear or a horn, like boom, now you've got perfect symmetry across. Or same if I wanted to add a mouth hole, like if I wanted to make this into a mouth, just highlight it and delete the face. You can see it's also on the other side, which is, yeah, so learning how to properly use the mirror modifier is useful. Oh, and turn on clipping when you use it too. It just means that any connecting vertices actually connect. Like I can't disconnect these from the middle, I can only move it up and down. And it just means that you'll have a nice smooth mirror across the whole shape. I guess I can keep going if people want me to keep going. I'm just eating this food that's been sitting on my desk for a sec. Hold on. Yeah, so I mean that's the main ways you're going to manipulate a shape is adding edge loops, extruding parts, and then adding new edge loops to kind of manage those extrusions, and then highlighting vertices. And the same way you move the whole shape with, like, you know, the G, X, G, Y, G, Z, and rotations with the R, or scaling with the S. You just do that for individual parts of your mesh. So if I want to make these spikes spikier, I'll just highlight just these. Let's just go into solid mode. So yeah, obviously highlight those vertices, click S to, you know, bring it to more of a point. But now I want it to be curved. I don't want it to be these perfect straight. So in edit mode, I Control R, add an edge loop, place it, I don't know, right about here, and then GY to bring it over this way, and now boom, we've got some nice curved horns. Yeah, so that's basically that. You just you know, add to your shape, manipulate as you go. Oh, that's another little trick. So if I wanted to move this vertex down, there's two ways I can do it. I can press G, Z, and it perfectly moves down. But I can also, you can double tap G. So if you double tap G, the vertex is going to move only along like an edge that it's connected to, basically, which can be super useful if you want to just make, for example, this curve here. I want to make it less. Like I want to make it come more in, basically, before it goes down. So I would highlight both of those, double tap G, and then slide that along there, for example. And you can also use it sort of oppositely. If I wanted to actually do the opposite and bring this out to make more of a pointed elbow, I could either do GY to move it out, or you can double tap G, and then while you're in here, so while it's along this, moving along those lines, if you hold Alt, it'll extend that and let you bring it out all the way to the other side. And these are just little kind of tips that help the modeling process go faster. And yeah, so that's how you model. Really, you just keep adding to your shape, keep manipulating and rotating. So like if I wanted to add a new little spike that actually comes off to the left, I could highlight that, extrude up, look face on with the X, press R to rotate those, and then extrude again, you know, then shrink it a little bit, and now we've got like an extra little point to our horn. Yeah, I guess then once you know have your, say, let's just give it some eyes, so we actually have I guess something. Let's get rid of that. Let me just take its mouth in, so there's actually something there. Control R just to bring that edge back, and then, oh yeah, and so if you want to close up something, so right now I'm going to close up this hole. If you want to, so basically make a face in between these four vertices, you highlight the vertices and then you click F, and that like closes it up. So now I'm just going to quickly spawn some spheres. GY, just bring it forward a little, shrink it down. Just going to right click and then shade smooth so it's smooth. Give it a subdivision subsurface. I'm just going to squash it in the x-axis and place it right here, and then shift D is how you duplicate things. So with that item selected, shift D, and then it's automatically like being dragged around. So then I'm just going to click Y to just move it to here, then click GY. And I'm actually going to group these two into one object. So the way you do that is you click one, and then shift click the other, and then Control J will join them. So now they've become one single object. So yeah, just click them, G and X, just to drag them there. So now we have this weird square dude character. Let's drag that back up. Let's position our camera in a way that actually frames the shot. So yeah, the camera's just like anything else in the world, so you can just click it and rotate it and drag it around from the camera view too. So if you click this, it looks down your camera, and then if your camera is selected, you can then drag it around and control middle mouse. Is it control? No, you gotta be G, sorry, middle mouse will act as like a zoom in and out. So if you have the camera selected and you click G for moving, then click the middle mouse button, you get this zoom in and out kind of things. Let's get rid of that light back there. So we have some.
Hey, Chemistry Boy, shout out to you, man. I've never been interested into modeling, but just seeing you work around this literally makes me want to just test it out and just see where it goes. Cause
Yes,
this
that's
fucking
basically
amazing.
Yeah, that's basically where I started. I was like, that looks fun. I'm gonna try that, and now I'm here. So
It's amazing.
nice.
I was
Sick,
go for
man.
5 minutes and you build a whole robot.
I mean, oh, I'm sad you missed that. I mean, it's recorded. You can go back and watch. But, I mean, it's just a simple square with some lines and some extrusions, really. But yeah, I was just going to set this up to texture it. So, I mean, one thing about rendering nice images is lighting is just insanely important. Like, you could have the nicest model in the world, and if it's lit terribly, then a bad model is going to just look nicer in a render. It's like you need good lighting, and like getting good at lighting, it's not easy because I mean that's why there's literally people paid to do lighting on movies and whatnot. But one simple tip that can help with Blender, let's just get rid of all the lights, is there's an add-on called Trilight. So in Edit Preferences and Add-ons, if you search for light, and then you turn on this tri-lighting add-on. If you have an object selected, then you do Shift A, go to lights, then there's 3-point lights. And so it basically sets up this nice 3-point light setting for you. So I like to then just bring them all GZ, bring them all down, and I kind of prefer it if it's a little bit rotated more like this. Just pull that there. So like this is a kind of a standard ideal lighting setup. You want one light from one side, nice and bright, to create shadow essentially, but this is a bit harsh, so I'm going to make it bigger, which makes it softer, which kind of smoothens out the shadows like you saw there in the background. So that's one of the important factors of lighting to remember, is the smaller and brighter your light source, the more harsh your shadows will be, versus at the same brightness, the bigger your light source, the softer the shadows will be. And softer shadows often make for a nicer photo, unless you're going for that harsh shadow. So you want one kind of big, nice, harsh light. Again, a second large light that will kind of just fill in a bit of the shadow detail. So I just make that big. Yeah, so that one, it's just kind of there just that you don't have like, from this camera angle we can't really see the shadows, but if we could see here, it would just help fill in a little bit of the shadows. So we just turn that just a little bit. So we still have shadow, but just so we don't lose detail in those shadows basically. And then you want a nice big backlight just to, well, we don't like that floor. Like, yeah, I'm not setting this up perfectly, but just get ready. Yeah, I've not got this camera in a great spot, honestly, for this lighting right now, but the backlight is just to give a highlight to the object. It's not doing it nicely right now. Let's just make this way further back, and then stretch this out more into that direction. Yeah. I know why. It's because the world is so dark. Move this up. Give some more overall brightness. Yeah, I mean, it's not showing nicely on these shapes, honestly, but is it way too bright? Basically, though, yeah, you want directional lighting from one side, a fill light just to fill in some of the detail that you might lose in some of the shadows, and then usually a backlight just to separate your object from the scene. So make this a bit darker, that might help. Actually, it doesn't help that our object is white, because then we can't see really the lighting on it. Yeah, that's a little better. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I was going for, but it's not perfect. Obviously, I'd work a lot more on it if I was making a real scene. You just want something to highlight some of your edges, just to kind of separate it from the background. And yeah, that's a simple scene. And so for texturing a character, I guess for materials, one of the simplest ways that at least you need to know quickly is how to color different parts of one object to different colors. So right now, if we want to make these arms, legs, and the horns 3 different colors, and the body a different color, but they're all one object. So right now, without knowing how to do it, you would be lost to be like, well, the object's this color. It's you know, it's whatever color I set it to. How can I change it? So what you do is you choose the vertices you want to be a certain color. So if we want the arm, I'm just going to highlight these 4. Is that 4? No, that's 8. Highlight those 8. And then for the rest, I'm going to click C just to bring up this selection tool circle, and then just highlight them all like that, just because it's faster. And then right click to go off that. Then over in this materials, on the materials tab over here, click this little plus, and then click assign. And now that assigns this part of our mesh to that secondary material. So then we can make that like yellow if we want. And so then we do the same thing for the legs. I'm just going to go into this mode because it's easier to see the vertices. Oh, not that one. Those 4. Highlight those. Go back to rendered mode. Yeah, so click the plus again, click assign, new material. We'll make these green. Why not? And then yeah, obviously that's, you know, that's that. So,
Hey, just a quick question. The reason why both arms are switching colors because you have that mirror effect.
yeah, exactly. So this
currently on, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This side's not really even here right now. Like it's the Blender's just doing the maths to mirror this object. So the mesh for this side doesn't actually like exist until you apply the mirror modifier. So if I wanted to make this arm another different color, then I would have to go and apply the mirror modifier, basically. Which, yeah, I can do that now just to show. So yeah, now anything I do here happens to the other side. But say you wanted, you know, I don't know, for some reason, this part to be blue, but you only wanted it on one hand. In this case, what we would do, go to the modifiers, click on this little arrow button, and then apply the mirror. So now it gives us the mesh for the entire shape. So if I wanted to bring this back to yellow, I would just highlight that part of the mesh, go back to our material, click on the yellow and assign, and then now we've got a separate one there. But like, you want to apply the mirror right at the end. That way, like, you want to make that the last thing you do once it's kind of done, and there's nothing like, and you have to, like, if you don't have to do it, just don't bother, because there's less computation in the render then, because there's less mesh to load in when you render it. So the more mirrors you can leave, the better. Only really apply it if you have to.
Awesome. Thank you, man. Appreciate you.
No worries. And on that point of actually with mirrors, if I just go back to before I applied it. So when you're editing something from a mirror, you want to do it in mirror mode. I mean, in edit mode. You don't want to really do it in object mode, especially if they're separated objects. So if I wanted, for example, for some reason, because this is a really weird like little character now. If I wanted a weird donut shape to hover over his hand, and I wanted it to be on both sides, what I would do is put one here. I would, because this point here, the cursor is already set to this object, right? Because we did that earlier. So I could use that point to mirror this, and it'll go to the other side. So I right click on it now, origin to 3D cursor, because that's what that thing is. And then I give it the mirror modifier. Right now it's doing it along the x-axis, so I still don't actually fully understand how what these mean, because I don't see why it mirroring upwards is the x-axis when that's the z-axis, but whatever. Y-axis puts it where I want it.
Because X is across.
Yeah, but like it's the z-axis. So why does the z-axis mirror
Because it's
across
3D,
the
so
x?
it's X, Y, Z, and Z is back, like depth.
Yeah, I
and
guess. It's
X
just
is,
it's
yeah.
annoying that it doesn't follow the built-in axes of the world, I guess.
Because it's just like a different computational engine for 3D spaces.
Yeah, yeah. Well, at least now I know. But yeah, so when you're modeling a mirrored object, if I want this to be slightly different, like I want to do that to it or something, or if I want to move it slightly to the side, but on both sides, do it in edit mode. So just select the whole object, then move it, because then it maintains the mirror center. Because in edit mode, when you move the object, you don't move the origin point, the little orange dot, whereas in object mode, it moves that orange dot, and obviously that orange dot controls where you mirror from. So if you're ever editing an object like this, because, yeah, for whatever reason, just make sure you do it in edit mode so that it doesn't lose your mirror position, basically. Yeah, I think there's not much more I can go into basics-wise. Anything else would get more and more complicated from here, so I'm going to call it there and stop the recording.